When you think of ancient slavery, most likely the images that come to mind are Hebrews laboring in cruel Egyptian bondage.
You've guzzled enough. Bring those bricks up and get on.
Or oarsmen rowing galleys across the Mediterranean. Or even gladiators fighting to the death in Roman arenas for the enjoyment of bloodthirsty crowds.
Well, why doesn't it kill him? Kill him. Well, what's the matter now? Kill him!
Kill him, you imbecile.
Kill him!
Kill him!
Kill!
But do these harsh pictures of slave life in antiquity really reflect the historical reality? Or was ancient slavery just BS? Let's find out. Greetings, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and it is an unfortunate characteristic of our species that as far back as we have written records, going back to something like the Code of Hammurabi from the 18th century BC, we have detailed records governing the use of other human beings as slave labor. Think for a moment what that says about the nature of the human species, that we seem always to have done stuff like that to one another.
I wouldn't go around spouting that shit I was you. People around here don't think that way. I don't think that way.
I think the honorable thing for our species to do is deny our programming. Stop reproducing. Walk hand in hand into extinction. One last midnight, brothers and sisters opting out of a raw deal.
Use the word slave, and I think most people assume that what you were talking about is actual human property. That you've got one person being owned by another person as their stuff. And certainly that sort of slavery, the technical term is chattel slavery, existed in the ancient world. Unfree labor in the ancient world encompassed a spectrum running from chattel slavery through serfdom to things like debt peonage, and often the dividing line between these various statuses was fairly unclear. Definitely we have examples of those sorts of intermediate categories, reference the helots in Sparta, sort of unfree peasants, or coloni, essentially tenant farmers in the provinces of the Roman Empire. It wasn't all just chattel slavery in the ancient world. The common feature of all of these statuses, however, was simply that one's labor was not free, that those people didn't have control over their own work, but that was directed by someone else. That said, what we'll be focusing on here for the most part is the version of unfree labor where an individual was the actual property of another person. Keep in mind, though, that a great deal of what we're going to say about that applies in varying degrees to the other categories of unfree labor as well in the ancient world. Whatever one's status, one important thing to keep clear is that there was no widespread belief in human equality or any sort of sense a la Jeffersonian rhetoric that all men are created equal. Far from it. In fact, the opposite was the assumption for most of the societies of the ancient world, that human beings were at birth unequal, and that their status, their privileges, their possibilities in society should reflect that unequal status. Indeed, the philosopher Aristotle, in his discussions on slavery, held that there were certain people who were simply by nature born to be slaves, and who were thus better off being dominated by the superior members of society. Now that we are clear on our terminology, maybe we ought to talk about on what was slavery based in the ancient world then? Like, how did you become a slave? Let's get one thing out of the way from the get-go. Probably the model that a lot of people in the modern world have in their minds are the comparatively more recent examples of race-based slavery. Whatever creepy, horrible qualities ancient slavery may have possessed, racism was not one of them. Racism is a specifically modern ideological construct that is only about, 400 or 500 years old, and was fundamentally alien to the ancient world. Certainly, folks in the ancient world would have had some sense of ethnic difference, would have believed that people from different regions, had different cultures. Obviously, they recognized that people from different places often looked a little bit different, but they did not take those differences to correspond to some sort of deeper biological difference, that certain categories of humans had different, not just physical, but also spiritual, moral, and intellectual characteristics. That racist stuff, that's one of the ways in which the modern world is uniquely creepy and awful. The ancient world had its own thing. So what was slavery based on? First of all, one common way to be enslaved in the ancient world was to find yourself on the losing end of a war. That you're fighting, say, another city-state, and they just happen to kick your ass.
So you get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
And perhaps you're one of the lucky ones, in that you are not put to the sword, but are rather taken captive as a prisoner of war. Although, is that actually the luckiest outcome? Because then you could be enslaved and be forced to labor as the property of the victors. Enslavement as a result of being taken captive in war is perhaps the clearest example of a theory of slavery that has been popularized by the scholar Orlando Patterson, arguing that slavery is based on what he terms social death. That rather than being outright killed, what happens when someone is enslaved is that they are severed from all of their ties to the rest of society. The bonds of kinship or belonging in any sort of wider community are totally erased. That person is sort of extracted from their human network and reintegrated as a piece of chattel property. So it's not death, but it's the closest thing to death that one can experience while still being physically alive. Another common means of being enslaved in the ancient world was through debt. That is to say that an individual incurred an obligation to another person so profound that the only way to make it right was through a total alienation of control over one's labor. And that could be for a person, or certainly we have examples where the male head of household, in order to satisfy a debt, transfers control over the labor of his spouse or his children to another individual of society. So think about that for a moment. Like, thanks, Dad. Like, you went into so much debt that now I'm a slave. Like, God, you think your parents suck. How about that? All right, so that's how you became a slave. What was life like for slaves? It varied a lot. There were certain varieties of slave labor in the ancient world that would have been virtual death sentences, that the slaves in question simply couldn't survive that sort of work for more than a few years. So your actual galley slaves or laboring in mines, those were very, very harsh. You did also have slaves used as agricultural labor, slaves as household servants. As a best case scenario, you had categories of slave like scribes, who specifically were trained to have literacy skills to be able to keep records and write stuff down. Obviously, those sorts of slaves were treated comparatively better than other varieties of slave just because they represented a substantial investment of time and wealth to get that sort of training. That they could be mistreated like anybody else who is enslaved, but at the same time, in much the same way that you could just break your laptop or your tablet or something like that. But why would you? Because that's thousands of dollars worth of investment. Probably you're not going to do that to your scribe. But even in the best cases, it's just not a good gig to be somebody else's property. That slaves in the ancient world did not have rights at all, basically, and their masters could do what they wanted. Obviously, they controlled their labor. They could discipline them however they want through the use of corporal punishment. They could torture them.
So it's to be torture. I can cope with torture.
Indeed, in ancient Rome, the judicial testimony of slaves was admissible only when it was extracted under torture, and slaves were the only category in Roman society that were legally allowed to be tortured. Slaves in the ancient world were also expected to be sexually available to their owners too, that they did not have any control over their sexuality. Typically, children born to slaves in the ancient world were likewise themselves the property of the person who owned that slave. Slaves did not have family rights at all. Marriages could be broken up. They had no legal status. There was no legal bond between a slave parent and their children. And even if a slave was freed, their children remained the property of the master. How did slaves react to these sorts of circumstances? We do have some documentation of slave resistance. In all slave societies, since they have no incentive of their own to work well for the master beyond discipline, work slowdowns, sabotage of the labor if they can get away with it, seem to have been pretty common. There seem to be a lot of sources in ancient Rome, for example, of masters who were almost paranoid of slaves potentially plotting against them, plotting to murder them. We do have some examples of that actually happening. Certainly, I think that qualifies as resistance on the part of slaves and indicates that they were not entirely pleased with their lots in life, even if we don't have sources from them directly. Probably the biggest examples that we have involve actual slave insurrections. The biggest of these were the so-called servile wars, slave rebellions against Rome. Probably the most famous one is the Third Servile War of the late 70s BC. That was led by the famous former gladiator Spartacus, and included, when all was said and done, an army of more than 100,000 slaves. Unfortunately, all of these rebellions did not succeed. And I think, any of this spectrum of resistance didn't take the form of principled objection to slavery as an institution. Abolitionism was not a thing in the ancient world, and even slaves who did gain their own freedom sometimes themselves owned slaves. Like the whole notion that we should get rid of slavery full stop, that does not seem to have been present at all in antiquity. There was a recognition that to be a slave was not a desirable status, but nobody argued that slavery itself should be gotten rid of. And indeed, slavery was incredibly prevalent in a lot of these societies, and more so as time went on. It was there in the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, but it doesn't seem to have been a dominant social institution until the advent of classical Greek society, and even places like, for example, the classical Athenian democracy of the 5th century. As much as 30% of the Athenian population, so a good 30,000 or more inhabitants of the city of Athens were slaves. 1st century Rome, so the empire at its height. We are talking about a good 2 million slaves. 35% of the overall Roman population were slaves. So these were societies that were to a great extent founded upon the institution of slavery and depended upon slave labor for the functioning of their economy and their broader prosperity. And it is maybe on the surface something of an irony that these two societies, Greece and Rome, which in some ways were so free. I mean, the Athenian democracy, Athenian citizens had enormous rights. It's maybe less so with citizens of the Roman Republic and the early empire, but still broad protections under Roman law, a certain sense in which, they were at least stakeholders in Roman society, and yet both of those societies, so free in other respects, so dependent upon unfree labor. But they wouldn't have seen this as a contradiction. I think that people in, say, Athens or Rome kind of acknowledged that slavery was the sort of dark shadow of the liberties that citizens enjoyed, that some people had to be fundamentally unfree in order for those other individuals to enjoy as much freedom as they did. Worth reflecting on how many of the freedoms that we enjoy are perhaps dependent upon labor that is coerced from other individuals in other parts of the world. Maybe this juxtaposition of liberty on the one hand and slavery on the other persists in a different form to this very day. Recommended readings and media. For an ancient source, we mentioned Aristotle. The first book of his Politics from the 4th century BC gives you one enormously talented and influential philosopher's discussion of the role played by slavery in his society, and not an uncritical portrayal. In terms of modern scholarship, Ancient Slavery and Modern Ideology by the great Moses Finley is a brief but information-packed overview of this. It's about 120 pages, but it is a great primer on ancient slavery and how it worked. We also mentioned Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, a comparative study, which has the virtue not just of dealing with slavery in the ancient world, but kind of comparing it to more modern varieties, not just in the West, but all over the planet, to try and draw some lessons about, what are the common characteristics of slavery. The recently deceased David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years, is a fascinating rethinking of the origins of human economics. It deals not just with the ancient world, but takes it up to the modern period and talks about how debt and this notion of obligations between people is at the core of our ideas about economics. Well worth your time. He will be sorely missed. Finally, for a bit of media, the 1960 Stanley Kubrick film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas as the slave rebel who fought against Rome. Is it a historically accurate portrayal of this slave rebellion? I mean, there are things about it that are accurate, but it's very entertaining. Its heart's in the right place. Probably it is best read as a sort of radical left-wing commentary against the right-wing McCarthyist environment of America during the time it was made, but still it is a fantastic, entertaining movie. So to conclude, was the portrayal of ancient slavery as a brutal and cruel institution BS? No! Come on! Of course, it always sucks to be a slave. It is never fun to have your work controlled by another individual. And yet, slavery was a very important part of what made Western culture what it was in the ancient world. Certainly an important part of history, definitely worth studying. No, it's not BS. That's all for now. Always check your sources and evidence. See you later. Bye.